There are several beetles, in addition to flea beetles, that one can find on vegetable crops and to a lesser extent on fruit crops. And perhaps the most conspicuous of these might be the Colorado potato beetle, a fairly large beetle that is quite important as a pest of potatoes. It damages few other vegetables, a little bit on eggplant, uh, but is mostly feeding on potatoes and various kinds of nightshade family weeds. In fact, it is native to southeastern, or southwestern, and United States and Mexico, where it developed originally on a native weed out there called buffalo burr, which is kind of a spiny weed. And then when potatoes came into the area, they found that to be a suitable crop as well. They moved on to potatoes. They moved their way to the eastern coast and up to the Pacific Northwest. Somehow got on a boat and uh, made it to Europe, mainland Europe. They're the number one pest of potatoes in mainland Europe. Not found in the UK yet. Life cycle is typical of beetles. Adults are the overwintering form. They're going to be hiding somewhere in the vicinity of the field in which it was infesting the previous year. They'll lay eggs on leaves, the larvae will feed on the leaves, and they pupate in the soil. Generally 2 generations a year. It kind of depends on the temperature. If it's a warmer summer, more of them will go to 2 generations. If it's a cool, slow spring, then some of them will go into diapause after the first generation. Eggs are laid as masses on the leaves of host plants, and this is one of the very few insects I think you could find on a vegetable crop that kind of looks like eggs of a lady beetle. They're elliptical. They're laid on leaves. They tend to be bigger than lady beetle eggs. They're more orange in general than lady beetle eggs, and they're only laid on nightshade family plants. But if you don't know what big is, you know how do you know if it's bigger than a lady beetle egg? But this would be the comparison right here. And again, only on nightshade family plants would you find them. Lady beetles could lay their eggs on any kind of plant as long as there's some kind of prey nearby. Colorado potato beetle larvae are quite dark red when they first come out of the egg, and later become more of a pink, big fat, not particularly attractive looking insect. They feed on the leaves, and here we see them doing quite a bit of defoliation, a little bit closer up of the kind of injury they do produce. So this is a classic indirect kind of injury. So they are not damaging the tubers, which are below ground. They're damaging the foliage that produces the tubers. So they don't cause direct injury to the crop, but by losing photosynthetic area, they contribute to yield loss. And quite a bit of work has been done on defoliation on potato and how it responds to yield loss. And plants are most susceptible when they stop producing new leaves and then shift into producing uh, the tubers, and that happens about the time if you see potatoes flower. That those two things coincide. But early on, when potatoes are producing lots of leaves, highly vegetative, extremely resistant to the effects of defoliation, they can tolerate this. They can recover very well. So you could easily have 30% leaf loss early in the season and not see any effect on yield. It gets a little more critical again when it is coinciding with the time when the plant shifts into producing tubers, goes from vegetative to reproductive forms or storage forms. There are some natural enemies of the Colorado potato beetle. One lady beetle that you might see, it's fairly widespread in the United States, called the pink spotted lady beetle. It's very pink, and it is mostly a beetle feeding lady beetle. So it's feeding on the eggs of Colorado potato beetle here, and it might even feed on some small larvae. There are some stink bugs that are specialists on beetle larvae. This one on the lower left, the two-spotted stink bug, and some other relatives that have these little two spots behind the head. These are also ones that specialize in various kinds of beetle larvae. And then there's a tachinid fly that attacks Colorado potato beetle. Moving on, something a little different, but just want to point out that there is a beetle that is very commonly confused and mistaken for Colorado potato beetle in some parts of the country, and that's one that occurs on sunflower. So sunflower beetle Does feed on the leaves of sunflower. It's a very minor insect in terms of damaging the plant, but you can see the adult in the upper left looks very similar to the colored potato beetle. One thing to notice on the sunflower beetle, notice the line is broken on the side. It looks kind of like an exclamation point, and that's, you can see that in its species name. The larvae are green and feed on the leaves of sunflower. Now move on to a different one. This is Mexican bean beetle is in a different family. It's in the lady beetle family, and it feeds just on beans. It's a native to North America as well. Extended its range into the U.S. Originally found in Mexico and southwestern United States, and it feeds mostly on the leaves. It is a true lady beetle. This is an insect in the lady beetle family. Most beetles that feed on leaves are in the leaf beetle family, Chrysomelidae. These are in the lady beetle family, and this is the bad apple of the lady beetle family. It's one of the very few that feed on foliage of plants. So life cycle is, again, typical beetles. Adults lay eggs. Eggs beget larvae. Larvae do most of the feeding. Then they pupate. In this case, they pupate on the plant, and we'll show you that. So multiple stages indicated right here. We can see a larva on the upper left. We can see a larva just underneath that has settled and is just about ready to pupate. A couple pupae on the right, and then a newly emerged adult. So the adult Mexican bean beetles all look fairly similar in terms of patterning. They're spotted, a highly spotted kind of beetle, but you may see differences in their coloration. And when they are that browner color, then they are a form that is maturing eggs and producing eggs. If they stay light, then they haven't matured eggs yet, so they've gone perhaps into diapause. So they lay eggs in masses similar to those of other lady beetles. These look like lady beetle eggs. They are lady beetle eggs, but you'll only find them on beans. The eggs hatch, and the larvae of the Mexican bean beetle is a little different than a typical lady beetle larvae. They're quite spiny. They're yellow, and of course they feed on the leaves. So here are a little one and a late stage larva, but again, very distinctive. Don't look anything like a normal lady beetle. And the kind of injury they do, and we're going to return to this kind of injury pattern, it's called skeletonizing, where they feed on the leaf, but they tend to avoid larger veins and one of the leaf surfaces, usually the upper leaf surface, because they feed on the lower leaf surface almost entirely. But this pattern of feeding produces essentially a skeleton of the leaf, and there are relatively few kinds of insects that are skeletonizers. So keep this in mind. Skeletonizing, if you see that on some kind of plant, you will have a short list of insects on that plant that are skeletonizers. And this is the first one we're encountering. When we get into some of the tree and shrub insects, mostly in the next class, there's quite a few more we'll come into. But skeletonizing injury, again, is avoiding the main veins, leaving kind of a leafy texture. Furthermore, with this insect, they excrete, which is unusual for a beetle, kind of a fluid, a whitish fluid. So you'll see these little marks on the leaves too, that are good signs that they've been there. I mean, this is a no-brainer for diagnosis here. So the injury is often limited to just chewing some leaves, and as we have talked about several times, if you're losing a little leaf area, you can often have a lot of compensation by the plant. And when beans are vegetative, they can take low levels of defoliation or even moderate levels of defoliation up to 50% when they're vegetative before they start to set pods without any loss in yield. Extensive defoliation can, of course, be more damaging, and after pods have set, it becomes more damaging. But again, in many cases, you only see a little bit, particularly if you have bush beans, where you have the crop is in and out fairly quickly. If you're taking it to dry bean stage, as this field here is, then you tend to get a lot more buildup of the Mexican bean beetle in that field. So this would be extensive damage on older plants, and again, bush green beans, you wouldn't see this, but pole beans, which are in the ground and growing for a lot longer, you might see this happen more likely. And again, dry beans. These also can do some direct injuries. If you have it going late in the season and they have pods, you will sometimes see them feeding on the pods. It's both the larvae and the adults, and often we harvest green beans before you see this happening, but if they're out in the field for a little longer, you get increasing amounts of injury of this type as well, a direct injury. The larvae then pupate, showed you pictures of these, and then these are old skins of the pupae that are left behind, just showing you various kinds of things you might see on a bean plant that could help you diagnose. Even if you didn't see that adult beetle there on the left, you could see the old skins, and you would know that there had been ones that had emerged, because those are pupal skins. And as I mentioned before, lighter forms are not producing eggs. Darker forms are. As you go through the summer, increasing numbers of them are going into diapause. So not all of them have a second generation. So beetles that emerge in late July, maybe about 80% of them are around where I live are going to have a second generation. They'll mature eggs, but you get into mid-July and only about 20% of them are going to continue to lay eggs that you would see into September. And by the end of mid-August, by the end of August, essentially none of them are going to be laying eggs. They're all going into diapause. So adult beetles in diapause are the overwintering form. So what are ways to manage bean beetle? You can use shorter season varieties that can escape serious injury. Again, get them in, get them out. Also remove plants immediately after harvest. If you have developing stages on the plants, just don't leave the plants out there. Pull them, compost them, whatever, but that would prevent the insect from continuing to develop. You can hand pick eggs and larvae in small plantings. This is not a difficult insect to find. The eggs are pretty obvious. And of course, insecticides if severe injury is threatened. There is one biocontrol. I found remarkably few things eat this, but there is a biocontrol on the market. It's kind of an unusual thing because it is something that has to be introduced every year. It's a little wasp that lays its eggs in developing larvae, introduced early in the season. This has been able to suppress Mexican bean beetle well, at least in the mid-Atlantic states. But it's an insect that is not native to the area and doesn't diapause, so the wasp dies out. I mean, it keeps trying to find hosts. It's a native to India, but it doesn't survive here over winter, so it has to be introduced. Pretty pricey, too. I don't know what is killing the Mexican bean beetles around here, but often 40 to 60% of all the eggs in this area where I live don't hatch. And this is a desiccation injury. I don't know if it occurs to this extent in the east, or if this is something that's related to the high light, dry weather in this part of the world. But where I have seen it here, a lot of the eggs just die. And there are no real good natural enemies attacking them. Really nice summary of this insect is found in the Journal of Integrated Pest Management. This is a journal that I have as an assignment for this class. I would like you to look at this journal. It has good summary articles on a lot of kinds of insects that you might be interested in. So that's why I have you do this as an assignment later in this course. So this is the one that would be summarizing what's known about the Mexican bean beetle. A couple minor things to finish up with. There is another beetle that is a lady beetle that damages vegetable crops. It's called the squash beetle. and it's found in the eastern United States. It will chew a little bit on the leaves of squash. So we have two plant-feeding lady beetles, Mexican bean beetle being more widespread and far more damaging. But if you live in the east or southeast, you might see some squash beetles. Looks like a lady beetle. It is. Feeds a little bit on squash leaves. Not really an issue in terms of affecting yield. Squash produces an enormous amount of vegetation. And then if you're in the Midwest in particular, you might have another bean insect called the bean leaf beetle. So pretty much Midwest area. And it will come out fairly early in the season, and you might see it on the first beans that are coming up. It lays eggs in the soil, but the adults are feeding on the leaves. So you won't see the larvae of this on the plants. You just see the adults. So they'll chew on the leaves, and again, early in the season, beans are very tolerant of defoliation. This is insignificant damage right here. The larvae do feed on the roots and nodules of bean plants. Importance of damage by the larvae is unknown. People haven't ever been able to really prove that it's doing much, so I think we can largely ignore it. Leaf beetle larvae do develop far better in soils high in organic matter and moist soils. So this is something that is more likely to be a problem in the Midwest. It doesn't exist in eastern Colorado. It's too dry, low organic matter soils. But something you might see in much of the eastern half of the United States, particularly the Midwest. So the adults come out, feed on the leaves early. This is the primary kind of damage we see. Again, the levels of damage I'm seeing in this picture are probably being fully compensated by the plant. But they also will go on to pods. So this does a lot of pod feeding. So this can be a pretty important pest of green beans in particularly the Midwest. And then finally, just briefly mention, there is one other beetle that chews leaves quite a bit, the Japanese beetle. And some of the garden crops, the food crops that it feeds on would be beans and basil and raspberry. But we're going to talk about Japanese beetle in the next class. It's mostly a problem on ornamental plants and turf grass, but it does show up on a lot of different kinds of plants.